It all started with an ordinary bus ride, but one conflict changed the lives of everyone involved. How can the silence of some and aggression of others affect each of us? Don't forget to subscribe, share this video, and leave your opinion in the comments. What city are you watching us from? The relentless heat of August smothered the city, wrapping every street and building in a suffocating embrace. Pavement shimmered in the sunlight, exuding waves of warmth that distorted the view of the world. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of exhaust fumes and the faint trace of hot asphalt. Inside the creaking old bus, the atmosphere was hardly better. The half-functional air conditioning unit sputtered weakly, pushing out streams of warm air that offered no relief to the weary passengers. Mothers clutched restless children, sweat streaking their brows as they tried to keep their little ones entertained. Office workers sat stiffly in wrinkled shirts, their expressions blank, eyes glued to their phones or staring out of the smudged windows. The occasional jingle of a notification or a faint sigh punctuated the otherwise oppressive silence. At a stop near the bustling marketplace, the doors of the bus hissed open, releasing a brief, welcome draft of air. A figure stepped inside, silhouetted against the glaring sunlight. It was an elderly black woman, dressed in a neatly pressed floral dress, her white hair pinned back under a simple straw hat. Her name was Mrs. Evelyn Turner. She moved slowly, deliberately, her frail hands clutching a worn cloth bag filled with groceries. A loaf of bread peeked out from the top of the bag alongside a few apples and a carton of milk. She paused at the fare machine, fishing a few coins from her pocket and dropping them in with a soft clink. The driver, a young man who barely glanced her way, gestured vaguely toward the rear of the bus. Evelyn turned, her sharp yet kind eyes scanning the crowded vehicle. She spotted an empty seat by the window near the front, a rare find on such a busy day. With quiet determination, she made her way down the narrow aisle, avoiding the elbows and knees of passengers too absorbed in their own discomfort to notice her. As she reached the seat, Evelyn let out a soft sigh of relief and lowered herself into the chair. She placed her bag carefully on her lap, her thin fingers resting lightly on its handles. For a moment, she allowed herself to relax, leaning her head against the cool glass of the window. The bus lurched forward, the engine groaning as it began its slow crawl through the congested streets. Evelyn's mind drifted as she gazed out at the familiar cityscape. The towering brick buildings, the rows of mom-and-pop shops with their faded awnings, the children darting through fire hydrant streams, all of it was a part of the world she had known for decades. She thought about her late husband, Arthur, and the many trips they had taken together, his strong hand always steadying her as she stepped onto the bus. "Keep your back straight, Evelyn," Arthur's voice echoed in her memory, as clear and warm as if he were sitting beside her. "The world will try to bend you, but you don't have to let it." A faint smile crossed her lips as she adjusted her posture, her back instinctively straightening. She clung to those words, a shield against the weight of the years and the injustices she had faced. The bus hit a pothole, jarring Evelyn from her thoughts. She tightened her grip on the bag as the vehicle rattled and swayed. Around her, the passengers remained lost in their own worlds, barely acknowledging each other's presence. Evelyn, however, was acutely aware of the unspoken tension that lingered in the air, a quiet hum of unease that seemed to accompany every ride. At the next stop, the bus screeched to a halt and the doors groaned open. Another figure stepped on board, a white woman in her late 50s with short, meticulously styled blonde hair and a tailored navy suit. Her heels clicked sharply against the metal steps as she entered. Her face was flushed, her expression one of barely concealed irritation. She fanned herself with a folded newspaper, muttering under her breath about the heat. Mrs. Holly Peterson had had a long, exhausting day. Her boss had berated her in front of her colleagues that morning, and an important client meeting had gone disastrously wrong. To top it off, the air conditioning in her car had failed, forcing her to take public transportation, an indignity she felt she did not deserve. The heat, the crowd, the noise, all of it grated on her nerves, fueling the simmering frustration that had been building since sunrise. Her sharp eyes scanned the bus, searching for an empty seat. To her dismay, every spot was taken. Her gaze landed on Evelyn, sitting calmly by the window, her bag perched neatly on her lap. Holly's irritation flared into anger. Why should this woman, this stranger, get to sit while she, a hard-working professional, was forced to stand? Holly marched down the aisle, her heels clicking in an uneven rhythm as the bus swayed. She stopped directly in front of Evelyn, towering over the seated woman. Evelyn looked up, meeting Holly's piercing glare with a calm, steady gaze. "You need to move," Holly said, her voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby passengers. "I've been on my feet all day, and I need that seat." Evelyn blinked, her expression unchanging. "This seat is not reserved," she replied quietly. "I'm sorry, but I need to sit as well." Holly's face twisted with indignation. "Excuse me? I don't think you understand. I've had a very long day, and I'm not about to stand while someone like you hogs a seat." Evelyn's grip on her bag tightened, but her voice remained calm. "I'm sorry for your troubles, but my need to sit is just as valid as yours." Holly scoffed, glancing around at the other passengers as if seeking allies. Most of them avoided her gaze, their faces carefully neutral. A young man in the back whispered something to the woman beside him, but neither moved to intervene. The bus rumbled on, the tension inside it growing thicker with each passing moment. Evelyn held her ground, her dignity an unyielding fortress in the face of Holly's mounting fury. But the confrontation was far from over. The bus swayed slightly as it rolled over a patch of uneven road, its engine groaning with the effort. Inside, the tension from Holly's demand lingered like an unwelcome guest. Evelyn remained seated, her hands resting firmly on her grocery bag, her eyes fixed on the irate woman standing before her. Holly, meanwhile, was a picture of indignation. Her face flushed, her lips pursed into a thin line of barely contained fury. "You think you can just sit there and ignore me?" Holly snapped, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the other passengers. "I'm telling you, I need that seat. It's the least you could do." Evelyn looked up slowly, her expression calm yet resolute. There was a quiet strength in her voice when she replied, "And I'm telling you, I cannot stand for the remainder of this ride. I'm not moving." The simplicity of Evelyn's words seemed to infuriate Holly further. She leaned in closer, her voice rising with every syllable. "You're selfish, you know that. You're the reason people like me, people who work hard every single day, get overlooked. Do you even know what it means to work for something in your life?" The accusation hung in the air, its weight pressing down on everyone within earshot. A few passengers exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort evident. A young man in a hoodie leaned toward the woman sitting next to him, whispering something that earned a half-hearted nod in response. No one else spoke, their silence a fragile barrier against the escalating tension. Evelyn inhaled deeply, her gaze unwavering as she met Holly's glare. "I've worked more years than you've likely been alive," she said, her tone even, though there was a steely edge to her words. and I've endured far worse than this moment." Her words landed like a quiet clap of thunder, the kind that rumbles in the distance but promises a storm. Holly's eyes narrowed, her fists clenching at her sides. "Don't play the martyr," she hissed, her voice low but no less venomous. "You don't get a free pass just because you're old." At this, a faint gasp rippled through the bus. The young man in the hoodie muttered, "Whoa," under his breath, but still, no one moved to intervene. Holly straightened up, her chest heaving as she tried to steady her breathing. She looked around the bus again, searching for support in the faces of the passengers, but they all avoided her gaze. "Doesn't anyone else think this is ridiculous?" Holly demanded, gesturing toward Evelyn. "Why should I have to stand while she gets to sit there like she owns the place?" Her words were met with an awkward silence. A mother sitting near the back adjusted her toddler's position on her lap, her eyes fixed firmly on the floor. A middle-aged man with a newspaper coughed uncomfortably, flipping a page as if to shield himself from the scene unfolding just a few feet away. One voice finally broke through the silence. It belonged to a young woman seated near the middle of the bus, her phone held loosely in one hand. "Maybe you should just leave her alone," she said, her tone cautious but firm. "She's not doing anything wrong." Holly's head snapped toward the speaker, her expression incredulous. "Leave her alone? Are you serious? She's sitting there perfectly capable of moving, while I'm stuck standing like an idiot." The young woman shrugged, her cheeks reddening as the weight of Holly's anger turned toward her. "You're the one making a scene," she mumbled, quickly looking away. Holly let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Unbelievable," she muttered, shaking her head. She turned back to Evelyn, her expression hardening. "Fine. If no one else has the guts to say it, I will. You don't belong here. People like you, always thinking the world owes you something. Well, guess what? It doesn't." Evelyn's grip on her grocery bag tightened, her knuckles whitening. For a moment, she said nothing, the silence between them stretching unbearably thin. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and steady, but there was a fire in her words that hadn't been there before. "You don't know me," she said, her eyes locking onto Holly's with an intensity that made the other woman flinch. "You don't know what I've endured, what I've fought for, or what I've lost. So don't you dare stand there and tell me I don't belong." The bus jolted as it hit another pothole, the sudden movement breaking the momentary standoff. Holly stumbled slightly, catching herself on the back of a nearby seat. Her cheeks burned red with a mixture of anger and embarrassment, but she refused to back down. "You think you're better than me?" she spat, "sitting there with your self-righteous attitude, acting like you're above everyone else?" Evelyn shook her head slowly. "I don't think I'm better than anyone," she said, "but I also don't think you have the right to treat me this way." The tension in the bus reached a boiling point, the air heavy with unspoken words and restrained emotions. The driver glanced nervously in the rearview mirror, his hands tightening on the wheel. He cleared his throat and spoke over the intercom, his voice strained. "Ladies, I'm going to need you both to calm down. We're all just trying to get where we're going." Holly ignored him, her focus entirely on Evelyn. "You think you can just sit there and defy me? Fine. Let's see how long that lasts." With that, she reached forward and grabbed the handle of Evelyn's grocery bag, yanking it off her lap. The motion was sudden and forceful, sending the bag's contents spilling onto the floor. Apples rolled across the aisle, and the loaf of bread landed with a soft thud near the driver's seat. A collective gasp swept through the bus. Evelyn's eyes widened in shock, but she quickly regained her composure. She bent down to retrieve her belongings, her movements slow and deliberate. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up an apple, brushing off the dirt before placing it back in the bag. Holly stood over her arms crossed and her expression smug. "That's more like it," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. Evelyn rose to her feet, her grocery bag held tightly in her hands. She looked Holly directly in the eyes, her gaze unwavering. "You can try to humiliate me all you want," she said quietly, "but you won't break me." The words hung in the air like a challenge, daring Holly to respond. For a moment, the other woman hesitated, the certainty in her expression faltering. But the moment passed quickly, and Holly's anger flared once more. "You don't get to talk to me like that," she snapped. "Not after everything you've done." Evelyn tilted her head slightly, a faint hint of confusion crossing her face. "What exactly have I done?" she asked, "other than exist in a way you don't approve of?" The question seemed to catch Holly off guard, and for a split second she looked as though she might answer. But the driver's voice interrupted them, louder and firmer this time. "Enough," he said. "If this doesn't stop, I'm pulling over and calling the police." The bus fell silent, the threat of authority cutting through the tension like a knife. Evelyn returned to her seat, her grip on her bag as steady as her resolve. Holly, still fuming, retreated a step but didn't sit down. The other passengers avoided her gaze, their unease palpable. The bus continued its journey, but the atmosphere inside it was irrevocably changed. The conflict had begun, and everyone aboard knew it was far from over. The bus rumbled onward, its engine humming a steady rhythm, but the tension inside had grown to an unbearable pitch. Every passenger could feel it, an almost tangible weight pressing down on their chests. Holly, still standing over Evelyn, seethed with anger. Her lips were pressed into a thin, furious line, and her arms were crossed tightly over her chest. Evelyn sat stiffly, her hands resting on her grocery bag as though it were a lifeline. Her face was calm, but her posture betrayed the tension she felt deep within. The silence that followed the driver's warning was brittle, as if the slightest sound might shatter it completely. The bus hit another pothole, jostling its passengers. Holly stumbled slightly but caught herself, her heels scraping against the rubber floor. She straightened up, her frustration bubbling over once more. "You think you're so much better than everyone else, don't you?" Holly hissed, her voice low but venomous. "Sitting there, like a queen, like the world owes you something. Newsflash, lady, it doesn't." Evelyn didn't respond. Her silence was deliberate, a shield against the onslaught of words being hurled at her. She focused on her breathing, on the steady rise and fall of her chest. Years of practice had taught her that sometimes silence could be more powerful than any retort. But Holly wasn't satisfied. Her anger demanded a reaction, and Evelyn's calm demeanor only fueled her rage. She leaned in closer, her voice rising. "Are you even listening to me, or are you too proud to admit that you're in the wrong?" A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A young woman with earbuds in her ears pulled one out, glancing nervously at the scene. An older man in a business suit folded his newspaper and set it aside, his expression tense. Yet none of them spoke up. Evelyn finally looked up, her gaze meeting Holly's. "You've made your feelings quite clear," she said softly, "but I'm not going to move. You don't have the right to treat me this way." Holly's face twisted with fury. "The right? You're talking about rights? I have the right to sit after the day I've had. And you?" Her voice broke, trembling with emotion. "You're just sitting there, acting like I'm the problem." The young man in the hoodie near the back of the bus muttered something under his breath. The woman next to him gave him a sharp look, shaking her head slightly. It was as if the entire bus was collectively holding its breath, waiting for someone, anyone, to intervene. Holly took a step closer, towering over Evelyn. Her voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You think you can just sit there and ignore me? Fine. Let's see how you handle this." Before anyone could react, Holly reached down and grabbed the edge of Evelyn's grocery bag. With a sharp tug, she yanked it off Evelyn's lap, sending its contents spilling onto the floor. Apples rolled across the aisle, one of them bouncing against the driver's seat. The loaf of bread landed with a soft thud, and the carton of milk toppled over, leaking a thin white stream onto the floor. A collective gasp swept through the bus. Evelyn's eyes widened, her composure slipping for the first time. She bent down slowly, reaching for the scattered items. Her hands trembled as she picked up an apple, wiping it clean with her dress before placing it back in the bag. Holly watched her, her arms crossed and her expression smug. "That's right," she said. "Pick it up. Maybe next time you'll think twice about being so selfish." "Hey, that's enough," a voice called out. It was a young woman who had taken out her earbud earlier. Her face was flushed and her hands were clenched into fists. "You can't just treat her like that." Holly turned to face her, her eyes narrowing. "And what are you going to do about it? Sit there and lecture me? Maybe you should mind your own business." The young woman opened her mouth to reply but hesitated, glancing around at the other passengers. No one else spoke up. The older man in the business suit looked down at his hands, and the young man in the hoodie pretended to be engrossed in his phone. Evelyn finished collecting her groceries and placed the bag back on her lap. She straightened up, her hands gripping the handles tightly. Her voice was steady when she spoke. "You've made your point. But this," she gestured to the mess on the floor, "this says more about you than it does about me." Holly's smug expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Don't try to lecture me," she snapped. "You don't know anything about me." "And you don't know anything about me," Evelyn replied, her tone firm. "But that hasn't stopped you from judging me." The bus hit another bump, jostling its passengers once more. The driver glanced nervously in the rearview mirror, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. He cleared his throat and spoke over the intercom. "Ladies, I need this to stop. Right now. If it doesn't, I'm pulling over and calling the police." Holly ignored him, her focus entirely on Evelyn. She stepped closer, her voice rising again. "You think you're some kind of saint? Sitting there, pretending to be the victim? Let me tell you something. You don't deserve that seat any more than I do." "Then why do you think you deserve it more?" Evelyn asked quietly. Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that seemed to hang in the air. Holly didn't answer. For a moment, the two women stared at each other, the tension between them crackling like electricity. The bus rumbled on, the noise of its engine the only sound in the heavy silence. Finally, Holly stepped back, letting out a sharp, frustrated laugh. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, turning away. She grabbed the pole next to her and leaned against it, her expression stormy. The bus continued its journey, but the atmosphere inside it was irrevocably changed. The passengers sat in uneasy silence, their gazes darting between Holly and Evelyn. No one spoke, but the weight of what had just happened was palpable. Evelyn sat quietly, her hands still gripping her bag. She didn't look at Holly, nor did she acknowledge the stares of the other passengers. Her focus was inward, on the strength that had carried her through moments like this before. The driver exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing as the tension seemed to dissipate. But he knew, as did everyone else on the bus, that this was far from over. The oppressive silence in the bus was broken only by the faint hum of its engine as it trudged through the congested city streets. The passengers, each trapped in their own bubble of discomfort, sat stiffly in their seats, avoiding eye contact. Evelyn remained composed, her hands clutching her grocery bag as though it were a lifeline. Holly leaned against the nearest pole, her expression a storm of anger and frustration. Her earlier actions, scattering Evelyn's groceries and spewing venomous accusations, still hung in the air like the remnants of a thunderstorm. The bus jolted slightly as it hit another pothole, prompting the driver to glance into the rearview mirror. His jaw tightened as he surveyed the tense scene unfolding behind him. His name was Luis Hernandez, and after nearly a decade of driving city buses, he had seen his fair share of conflicts. But this one felt different. The aggression emanating from Holly and the stoic resilience of Evelyn created a tension so thick it seemed to seep into every corner of the vehicle. Luis cleared his throat, his voice crackling through the intercom. "Ladies, this is your first and final warning. If you don't settle this right now, I'm pulling over and calling the cops." His announcement sent ripples through the bus. A young mother glanced nervously at her toddler, pulling the child closer to her chest. An elderly man sitting near the front adjusted his glasses and muttered something under his breath. The atmosphere was electric, charged with unspoken fears and frustrations. Holly scoffed audibly, rolling her eyes as she pushed off the pole and took a step toward the driver's cabin. "Oh, please," she snapped. "You're really going to call the police because I told someone to move? How about you focus on driving instead of playing hero?" Luis's eyes narrowed as he slowed the bus to a crawl. He reached for the gear shift, his voice steady but firm. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask you again. If you don't sit down and keep quiet, I'll have no choice but to involve law enforcement." Holly threw up her hands, her frustration boiling over. "This is ridiculous. She's the one causing the problem, not me. I'm just asking for a little common courtesy, but apparently that's too much to ask." From her seat, Evelyn finally spoke, her voice calm but laced with an unmistakable edge. "What you're asking for isn't courtesy. It's submission, and I won't give you that." The words hung in the air, their weight palpable. Holly froze, her face flushing a deep crimson. For a moment, it seemed as though she might back down, but then her expression hardened, and she turned back toward Evelyn. "You think you're so high and mighty?" Holly hissed. "Sitting there like you're untouchable. Newsflash, lady, nobody's above the rules." "And what rule says I have to move for you?" Evelyn asked, her tone unyielding. "What gives you the right to demand that I give up my seat?" Luis sighed heavily, his patience wearing thin. He flipped on the turn signal and began guiding the bus toward the curb. The vehicle shuddered as it came to a halt, the screech of the brakes cutting through the rising tension. Outside, pedestrians glanced curiously at the stationary bus, their expressions a mix of confusion and mild interest. "All right," Luis announced, turning in his seat to face the passengers. "This is your stop, ladies, both of you. I'm not moving this bus until you step off." The declaration sent a wave of murmurs through the bus. The young woman with earbuds frowned, her gaze darting between Holly and Evelyn. The elderly man adjusted his glasses again, his expression unreadable. Even the toddler in his mother's lap seemed to sense the gravity of the situation, his wide eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before him. Evelyn looked at Louise, her brow furrowing slightly. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said quietly. "Why should I be forced to leave?" "Ma'am, I understand," Louise replied, his tone softening. "But I can't keep driving with this kind of disruption. I need you both to step off so we can all move on." Holly smirked, folding her arms across her chest. "Looks like you're not so special after all," she sneered. "Guess you'll have to move after all." Evelyn didn't respond. Instead, she rose slowly from her seat, her movements deliberate and measured. She picked up her grocery bag, the contents carefully reassembled after Holly's earlier outburst. Her gaze swept over the other passengers, some of whom looked away guiltily, while others offered her hesitant nods of encouragement. As Evelyn made her way toward the exit, she paused beside Holly. Her voice was calm, but there was steel in her words. "You may think you've won, but all you've done is show everyone here who you really are, and that's a far greater loss than you realize." Holly's smirk faltered, her confidence wavering under Evelyn's steady gaze. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she turned away, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. Evelyn stepped off the bus, her back straight and her head held high. The hot asphalt radiated heat beneath her feet as she stood on the sidewalk, adjusting her grip on her grocery bag. The bus remained stationary, its engine idling as Louise waited for Holly to follow. "Well," Louise said, his tone sharp. "You too, ma'am. Off the bus." Holly glared at him, her cheeks flushing with indignation. "You're seriously kicking me off? After everything she did?" "You heard me," Louise replied. "Both of you, now." With a frustrated growl, Holly stomped toward the exit, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She stepped off the bus, the door hissing shut behind her. For a moment, she and Evelyn stood side by side on the sidewalk, the stark contrast between them more apparent than ever. Inside the bus, the atmosphere began to shift. The passengers exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of relief and discomfort. The young woman with earbuds shook her head, muttering something under her breath. The elderly man picked up his newspaper again, though his hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it. Luis sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping as he released the brake and guided the bus back onto the road. The vehicle groaned as it picked up speed, leaving Evelyn and Holly behind. Evelyn watched the bus disappear down the street, her expression unreadable. She adjusted her bag and turned toward the crosswalk, her steps steady and purposeful. Holly, meanwhile, stood frozen in place, her hands balled into fists and her face a mask of simmering rage. The city moved on around them, oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded. But for Evelyn and Holly, the encounter was far from over. Each carried the weight of what had happened, though how they would bear it remained to be seen. The bus rolled away from the curb, its engine groaning as it merged back into the steady flow of traffic. Inside, the passengers were enveloped in a silence so oppressive it felt as though the air itself had thickened. The usual hum of quiet conversations and the sporadic sounds of notifications had vanished, leaving only the rhythmic vibrations of the vehicle as it rattled over uneven pavement. The driver, Luis, kept his gaze fixed on the road, his hands gripping the wheel more tightly than necessary. His jaw was clenched, and every so often, his eyes flicked toward the rearview mirror as though he were checking to ensure the storm had passed. But even as the bus returned to its route, the weight of what had transpired lingered heavily, pressing down on everyone aboard. Toward the back of the bus, a young man in a hoodie leaned against the window, his face partially obscured by the shadows. He pulled his phone from his pocket and opened the camera app, scrolling back to the video he had recorded of the incident. The screen lit up with the shaky footage of Holly yanking Evelyn's grocery bag, her voice raised in anger as the apples spilled across the floor. His thumb hovered over the upload button, but he hesitated. The young woman sitting next to him nudged his arm, her voice low. "Are you really going to post that?" He glanced at her, his expression conflicted. "I don't know. People need to see what happened, but—" He trailed off, his gaze dropping back to the screen. "But what?" she pressed, her tone sharper now. "You saw what she did. She humiliated that woman in front of everyone. And what did any of us do? Nothing." Her words hung in the air between them, a harsh indictment of their collective inaction. The young man shifted uncomfortably, his thumb still hovering over the screen. I don't know if it'll help," he said finally. "What if it just makes things worse?" She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "It's already bad. At least this way, people might care." In the middle of the bus, an elderly man folded his newspaper with deliberate slowness, his hands trembling slightly as he smoothed the edges. He glanced around, his gaze lingering on the other passengers. Many were avoiding eye contact, their gazes fixed firmly on their phones or out the window. The man cleared his throat, the sound startlingly loud in the silence. "Well," he said, his voice wavering slightly, "that was unpleasant." A few heads turned in his direction, but no one responded. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of the newspaper. "I just mean," he continued, "it's a shame. That poor woman didn't deserve any of that." The young woman near the back turned to face him, her expression a mixture of frustration and guilt. "Then why didn't you say anything?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Why didn't any of us?" The man blinked, taken aback. I didn't think it was my place," he stammered. "I didn't want to make things worse." "Worse?" she repeated, her tone incredulous. "How could it have been worse? She was being attacked right in front of us, and we all just sat here and watched." Her words sparked a ripple of discomfort among the passengers. A mother sitting with her young child glanced down at her lap, her cheeks flushing red. A man in a suit adjusted his tie, avoiding the young woman's gaze. "She's right," another voice chimed in. It was the young woman who had taken out her earbuds during the altercation. She leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "We all saw what happened, and we just let it happen. That's not okay." A murmur of agreement spread through the bus, hesitant at first but gradually growing stronger. The elderly man nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping. "You're right," he admitted. "We should have done something, but it's hard, you know? In the moment, it's hard to know what to do." The young man with the hoodie finally spoke up, his voice quiet but firm. "It's not just about what happened. It's about why it happened. That woman, Holly, she didn't just yell at her because she wanted a seat. She yelled at her because of who she was. That's the part that hurts the most." His words sent a ripple of unease through the bus. The passengers exchanged glances, their expressions varying from guilt to discomfort to quiet anger. The young woman beside him nodded, her gaze fixed on the floor. "She was so calm," she said softly. "The whole time, she didn't lose her temper. Even when Holly was screaming at her, even when she spilled her groceries, she just took it. And we let her." The young man tightened his grip on his phone, his jaw clenching. "I'm posting it," he said suddenly, his voice resolute. "People need to see this. They need to know that this kind of thing still happens." The young woman looked at him, her eyes wide. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "Yeah, it's not just about her. It's about all of us. If we don't do something, who will?" He pressed the button, and the video uploaded to his social media feed. Almost immediately, notifications began to pour in as his followers liked, shared, and commented on the post. The young man watched the numbers climb, a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension washing over him. Near the front of the bus, the mother with the young child spoke up, her voice hesitant. "Do you think she's okay?" she asked, her gaze darting toward the window. "The woman who got off, I mean. Do you think she's all right?" "I don't know," the elderly man replied. "I hope so. She seemed strong." "Stronger than any of us," the young woman with earbuds added. "She stood up to Holly, even when we didn't." The passengers fell silent again, their thoughts heavy with the weight of their collective failure. The bus continued its journey, but the atmosphere inside had shifted. What had once been a tense, simmering discomfort had transformed into something deeper, a quiet reckoning with their own complicity. Luis glanced into the rearview mirror, his expression pensive. He had done his best to de-escalate the situation, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had let Evelyn down. As he guided the bus through the labyrinth of city streets, he resolved to do better next time, to be braver, to stand up for what was right. For now, though, the bus moved forward, leaving the scene of the conflict behind. But for the passengers inside, the journey was far from over. As the bus disappeared down the street, the passengers inside carried the weight of their silence like an invisible burden. The video of the altercation, now uploaded and spreading quickly online, began to gather momentum. What had started as a raw, shaky recording of an everyday injustice transformed into a flashpoint, igniting conversations across digital spaces. The young man who had posted the video scrolled through the rapidly increasing number of comments, his heart pounding. Some were supportive. "This is disgusting. How could people act like this?" Others were accusatory. "Why didn't the person filming do something?" There were, of course, the inevitable detractors. "There's always more to the story. Bet this is blown out of proportion." But the most common sentiment was outrage, a shared disbelief that such a thing could still happen. Evelyn, unaware of her newfound visibility, walked steadily along the sidewalk, her grocery bag clutched tightly in her hands. The heat of the afternoon sun bore down on her, and the asphalt radiated waves of warmth that blurred the edges of her surroundings. She paused beneath the shade of a bus stop shelter, setting her bag down carefully on the bench beside her. The quiet hum of the city surrounded her, cars passing by, distant voices, the occasional bark of a dog. As she sat there, Evelyn reflected on what had happened. The sting of Holly's words lingered, not because they were new, she had heard worse in her lifetime, but because they reminded her of battles she thought she had long since fought. The familiar ache of resilience settled in her chest, a reminder that dignity often came at a cost. A man walking by glanced at her, his expression curious. He slowed for a moment, as if he wanted to say something, but then shook his head and continued on his way. Evelyn watched him go, her face unreadable. She had long since stopped expecting the world to understand her struggles, but the isolation of the moment still cut deeper than she cared to admit. Meanwhile, miles away, Holly sat in her air-conditioned apartment, scrolling through her phone. She had initially dismissed the incident on the bus as a minor annoyance, something that would fade from her memory as quickly as the heat of the day. But when she opened her social media feed, the video was the first thing she saw. Her face, twisted with anger, filled the screen. The caption below it read, "Racist attack on a bus today. This is why we need to do better." Holly's breath caught in her throat as she read the comments. Hundreds of people had already weighed in, their words a mixture of condemnation and vitriol. Some called for her to be fired, others labeled her a bigot. A few tried to defend her, claiming the video lacked context, but their voices were drowned out by the overwhelming tide of outrage. Her hands trembled as she set the phone down. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She was the villain in this story. Holly tried to rationalize her behavior, telling herself she had been tired, frustrated, pushed to her limit. But deep down, she knew those excuses wouldn't hold up, not against the glaring evidence of her actions. Panic set in. She thought about deleting her social media accounts, but the video had already spread too far. News outlets were picking it up, and her name was being shared alongside words like racist and entitled. Holly buried her face in her hands, the weight of her choices crashing down around her. Elsewhere in the city, Evelyn's name began to surface as well. Though the video didn't capture her speaking much, her calm demeanor in the face of Holly's aggression struck a chord with viewers. People began asking questions. Who is this woman? How did she stay so composed? A journalist from a local paper posted an open request for anyone who knew her to come forward, calling her a symbol of quiet strength in the face of hate. At the same time, a deeper conversation began to unfold online. People shared their own experiences with prejudice and discrimination, drawing parallels to what Evelyn had endured. Some wrote about the bystander effect, criticizing the passengers on the bus for their silence. Others focused on systemic issues, using the incident as a springboard to discuss broader societal problems. The video sparked debates in living rooms, workplaces, and classrooms. Teachers used it as an example in lessons about racism and moral courage. Activists referenced it in their calls for change. Even those who had never experienced such an incident found themselves reflecting on the roles they might play in similar situations. For Evelyn, the attention was unexpected and, at times, overwhelming. She began to notice people looking at her differently on the street, some with admiration, others with pity. A young woman approached her outside a grocery store one evening, her face alight with recognition. "Excuse me," the woman said hesitantly. "I just wanted to say, I saw the video. You were incredible. I don't know how you stayed so calm." Evelyn offered her a small smile, though her expression was tinged with weariness. "I've had a lot of practice," she said simply. The woman nodded, her cheeks flushing. "Well, thank you for standing up for yourself, for showing us how to be better." As the woman walked away, Evelyn felt a strange mixture of pride and sadness. She appreciated the sentiment, but she wished it hadn't been necessary in the first place. Meanwhile, the bus driver, Luis, found himself grappling with his own feelings of guilt. He replayed the incident in his mind, wondering if he could have handled it differently. Should he have sided with Evelyn more explicitly? Should he have called the police instead of asking both women to leave? The questions gnawed at him, leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. Luis's wife noticed his unease that evening as they sat down to dinner. "What's wrong?" she asked, her brow furrowing in concern. He hesitated, then sighed. "Something happened on the bus today. I didn't handle it the way I should have." She reached across the table, placing a hand over his. "You did the best you could," she said gently. "Sometimes that's all you can do." But Luis wasn't sure he believed that. The weight of his inaction stayed with him, a quiet reminder of the cost of complacency. As the days passed, the video continued to circulate, its impact growing wider. News outlets reached out to Evelyn for interviews, but she declined most of them, choosing instead to maintain her privacy. She didn't see herself as a hero, just someone who had done what she needed to do to preserve her dignity. Holly, on the other hand, found herself facing consequences she hadn't anticipated. Her employer issued a statement condemning her behavior, and she was placed on administrative leave. Friends distanced themselves, unsure of how to reconcile the person they knew with the woman in the video. Holly felt isolated, trapped in a prison of her own making. As the initial wave of attention began to subside, one thing became clear. The incident on the bus had left a mark, not just on those directly involved, but on everyone who witnessed it, whether in person or through the lens of a camera. It was a reminder of the power of choice. The choice to speak up or stay silent, to show kindness or cruelty, to stand firm or give in. For Evelyn, Holly, and the passengers on the bus, the journey was far from over. But for the world watching, it was a moment that wouldn't soon be forgotten. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting the city in hues of gold and amber. Shadows stretched across the sidewalks, wrapping the streets in a fleeting tranquility. Evelyn sat on the same bench at the bus stop where she had left earlier that day. Her grocery bag, still intact despite the earlier chaos, rested at her feet. The heat of the afternoon had mellowed, but the events of the day clung to her like an invisible weight. She looked out at the world around her, the ebb and flow of traffic, the chatter of pedestrians, the rustling of leaves in a faint breeze. It all seemed so ordinary, so detached from the confrontation that had unfolded just hours ago. Yet, Evelyn felt anything but ordinary. Her chest ached with a mixture of exhaustion and determination, the familiar weight of a lifetime spent standing her ground. A young woman with a stroller passed by, glancing at Evelyn with a flicker of recognition. Her lips parted as if to say something, but she hesitated and moved on. Evelyn let out a quiet sigh. She wasn't sure she wanted to hear the words, whether they were of admiration or pity. Both felt too heavy to bear right now. She adjusted her posture, straightening her back as Arthur's voice echoed in her mind. "Keep your back straight, Evelyn. Don't let the world bend you." The thought brought a faint smile to her lips. Even now, years after his passing, his wisdom guided her. She carried his lessons like a shield, using them to navigate the complexities of a world that was often unkind. Miles away, Holly sat alone in her dimly lit apartment. The curtains were drawn, shutting out the dying light of the day. Her phone buzzed incessantly on the coffee table, but she ignored it, unable to face the torrent of notifications. The video had gone viral, and her name was now attached to it in ways she could never escape. News outlets had picked up the story, labeling her the bus aggressor. The comments were relentless, each one a dagger to her already fragile sense of self. She scrolled through them earlier, her heart sinking with each new insult. Words like racist, entitled, and disgusting blared at her from the screen, a chorus of condemnation. Holly wanted to scream, to lash out at the world for judging her so harshly, but deep down, she knew the truth. She had brought this on herself. Her mind replayed the incident over and over, the memory of Evelyn's calm, unwavering demeanor cutting through her anger like a knife. Holly had felt so justified in the moment, so certain of her own righteousness. But now, with the distance of a few hours and the clarity that came with reflection, she saw her actions for what they were: ugly, cruel, and indefensible. She thought about reaching out to Evelyn, but the idea filled her with dread. What could she possibly say? "I'm sorry," felt hollow, a feeble attempt to absolve herself of guilt, and yet the weight of her actions pressed down on her, demanding some form of atonement. Holly picked up her phone, her fingers trembling as she typed out a message. "To the woman on the bus, I'm sorry. I was wrong. I let my anger and frustration get the better of me, and I took it out on you. You didn't deserve that." She stared at the words for a long moment before deleting them. Apologizing felt like the right thing to do, but the courage to follow through eluded her. The next morning, Evelyn returned to the bus stop. She carried the same grocery bag, though this time it was lighter, with only a few items inside. Her steps were steady, her resolve unshaken despite the events of the previous day. When the bus arrived, she hesitated for a moment before stepping on. The familiar hum of the engine and the worn seats greeted her like old acquaintances. The passengers were different this time, their faces unfamiliar. As she made her way down the aisle, she felt a few curious glances, but no overt stares. She found an empty seat near the back and settled in, her hands resting lightly on her bag. The ride was uneventful, the quiet rhythm of the bus lulling her into a state of introspection. She thought about the journey she had taken, not just in the past day, but throughout her life. The struggles, the victories, the moments of quiet resilience, they had all shaped her into the woman she was today. At one stop, a young man in a hoodie boarded the bus. He hesitated when he saw Evelyn, his eyes widening slightly in recognition. He moved to sit across from her, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. "Excuse me," he said, his voice hesitant. "Are you from the video?" Evelyn looked at him, her expression calm but curious. "I suppose I am," she replied. The young man fidgeted with his phone, his gaze darting to the floor. "I was the one who posted it," he admitted. "I thought people needed to see what happened." Evelyn regarded him thoughtfully. "And what do you think they've learned from it?" He blinked, caught off guard by the question. I think people saw how wrong it was, how unfair." Evelyn nodded slowly. "That's a start," she said, "but seeing isn't enough. What matters is what people do next." The young man nodded, her words sinking in. As the bus continued its journey, the two sat in silence, the weight of the conversation lingering between them. For Holly, the days that followed were a blur of isolation and self-reflection. She avoided social media, unable to face the onslaught of criticism. Her employer placed her on indefinite leave, and even her closest friends seemed distant, their messages terse and formal. One evening, Holly sat at her kitchen table, a pen and notepad in front of her. She had decided to write a letter to Evelyn, a genuine apology, free from the constraints of online performativity. The words came slowly, each one a small act of penance. "Dear Evelyn, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to say it anyway. I was wrong. I let my frustration and my own insecurities blind me to the harm I was causing. You showed grace and strength in a moment where I showed none. I'm deeply sorry for the pain I caused you, and I hope someday you can forgive me." Holly folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope. She didn't know if she would ever have the courage to deliver it, but writing it felt like a small step toward making amends. As the weeks passed, the video's momentum began to fade, replaced by the next viral moment. But for those who had witnessed it, whether in person or through a screen, the impact remained. The incident on the bus became a quiet catalyst, prompting discussions about racism, bystander intervention, and the power of resilience. For Evelyn, life returned to its familiar rhythm, though she carried the experience with her as a reminder of both the progress that had been made and the work that still needed to be done. She continued to ride the bus, her presence a quiet act of defiance against a world that often tried to push her aside. And, for Holly, the incident became a turning point. A painful but necessary reckoning with her own biases and shortcomings. She didn't know if she would ever truly atone for her actions, but she was determined to try. In the end, the bus ride was more than just a moment of conflict. It was a crossroads, a place where choices were made and truths were revealed. And for everyone involved, it was a journey that would stay with them long after the ride was over. Thank you for watching. If you found this story thought-provoking, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below and share this video with someone who needs to see it. Stay tuned for more compelling narratives. Watch our other videos and keep the conversation going.